Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the center of a quiet, overgrown cemetery on a gray, overcast afternoon in Pennsylvania. The air is eerily silent, devoid of the usual bird song, but the ground beneath your heavy boots feels unnervingly warm, radiating a physical heat that simply shouldn't be there. You look down and see wisps of acrid white smoke curling up from jagged cracks in the dry earth, smelling faintly of sulfur and rotten eggs. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie or a nightmare you are about to wake up from. This is a very real place in the United States. You are standing on top of a fire that has been burning uncontrollably for over 60 years, right beneath the feet of families who once called this place home. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious stories that exist in the hidden corners of our world, you have come to the right place. We post detailed narratives just like this one multiple times a week, so please gently tap that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a case. Today we are diving into the bizarre and terrifying history of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a town that was literally consumed by the earth. Let's get into the story of the fire that simply refuses to die and the people who live through the slow-motion nightmare. To understand the tragedy of what happened, we have to travel back to the spring of 1962, when Centralia was a bustling and tight-knit community of about 200 people, nestled in the rugged mountains of Columbia County. It was the quintessential American coal town, a place where hard work was the religion, and everyone knew their neighbor's business. The town was built directly on top of a massive labyrinth of anthracite coal mines, a resource that had brought prosperity and jobs to the region for generations. It was a proud town with 5 churches, 7 bars, and 2 schools, where children played in the streets until the streetlights hummed to life. However, beneath this veneer of small-town normalcy, there was a hidden geography that few people thought about on a daily basis. The coal mines that honeycombed the earth beneath Centralia were like a vast, black sponge, a complex network of tunnels and shafts that had been abandoned and unsealed for years. In May of 1962, the town council was focused on a much more mundane problem, a massive, overflowing landfill located in an old strip mine pit near the Oddfellow Cemetery. With Memorial Day approaching, the council wanted the eyesore gone to show respect for the town's veterans. So they made a decision that would doom them all. The council hired 5 members of the volunteer fire company to clean up the dump, but they didn't want to haul the trash away because it was too expensive. Instead, they decided to set it on fire, a practice that had been done in the past without major incident. Assuming they could control the burn, on May 27, 1962, the firefighters arrived at the pit, doused the mountain of garbage with flammable liquid, and tossed in a match. "Let it burn for a bit, then we'll drown it," the chief likely said, watching the flames roar to life against the piles of refuse. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming the debris as the firefighters stood watch with their hoses ready to extinguish the blaze. When the trash was reduced to ash, they flooded the pit with water, stirring the embers until everything seemed cool and dark. They packed up their gear and went home, believing the job was done and the town was ready for the upcoming holiday. But they had missed something crucial. Deep at the bottom of the pit, hidden beneath layers of wet ash and debris, was an unsealed opening to the labyrinth of coal mines below. 2 days later, the residents noticed something strange happening at the landfill. The fire had seemingly reignited itself. Smoke was once again billowing from the pit, so the fire department returned, puzzled but not panicked, and doused it with water again. "It must be deep-seated," one firefighter remarked, spraying thousands of gallons of water into the blackened crater. They extinguished it a second time, or at least they thought they did. But the fire was playing a game of hide-and-seek that they were destined to lose. Whatever water they poured into the pit was useless, because the fire had already migrated. A glowing ember had fallen through that unsealed hole and landed directly onto a vein of anthracite coal, which is known for burning incredibly hot and incredibly slow. While the firemen were spraying the surface, the fire was actually crawling downward, moving like a living thing into the deep, oxygen-rich tunnels that spread out beneath the entire town. It was no longer a trash fire, it was now a mine fire. a beast that is nearly impossible to kill once it wakes up. By early June, the signs that something was terribly wrong began to manifest in subtle, unsettling ways that the townspeople couldn't quite explain. People living near the cemetery started complaining about foul odors drifting into their homes, a smell that was distinct from the usual coal dust they were used to. It smelled like burning trash mixed with something chemical, a heavy scent that clung to clothes and curtains. The ground near the landfill remained hot to the touch long after the fire department had left, and wisps of steam began to rise from the soil in the early mornings. The town council, realizing the problem hadn't gone away, tried to fix it quietly, perhaps not wanting to cause alarm or admit that their cleanup plan had backfired. They hired a contractor to dig out the burning material with a steam shovel, hoping to physically remove the fire from the earth. But as the heavy machinery tore into the pit, the operators were met with a terrifying sight. When they opened the earth, massive plumes of fire and smoke roared up at them, fueled by the fresh oxygen they had just introduced. The fire wasn't just in the pit anymore, it was in the walls, moving deeper. The workers eventually had to stop because the carbon monoxide levels in the pit became lethal, making it impossible to breathe without specialized gear. They realized that every time they dug, they were just feeding the beast more air, causing the fire to spread faster and hotter into the mine shafts. The town of Centralia was beginning to realize that they were sitting on top of a ticking time bomb. But life on the surface continued with an eerie sense of normalcy. Children still went to school and parents still went to work, unaware that the ground beneath them was slowly turning into an oven. As summer turned into autumn, the fire continued its silent invasion, creeping inch by inch through the subterranean darkness. It moved beneath roads, beneath the cemetery, and eventually, it began to approach the basements of people's homes. The first true red flag for the residents came not from sight, but from temperature readings that were scientifically baffling. A gas station owner decided to check the temperature of his underground fuel tanks, and was horrified to find that the gasoline was registering at nearly 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth was cooking his inventory from the outside in. As the months turned into years, the residents of Centralia began to realize that the problem beneath their feet was not just going to fade away on its own. The fire, now firmly established in the labyrinth of coal seams, began to display a terrifying intelligence, moving in directions that engineers couldn't predict and appearing in places that should have been safe. The first winter after the fire started was particularly surreal for the children of the town, who noticed that the snow simply refused to stick to the ground in certain areas. They would walk to school bundled in heavy coats, passing patches of bare, steaming earth where the snowflakes sizzled and evaporated upon contact, creating eerie islands of brown in a sea of white. The federal and state governments eventually stepped in, launching a series of expensive projects designed to locate the boundaries of the fire and snuff it out for good. They brought in massive drilling rigs that roared from dawn until dusk, boring holes deep into the earth to pour in a mixture of wet sand and fly ash, hoping to suffocate the flames. However, every time they drilled a hole to test the temperature, they were met with a blast of heat that confirmed their worst fears. The fire was moving faster than they could drill. "It's like trying to catch a ghost," one engineer told a reporter, wiping soot from his forehead as he looked over the smoking landscape. While the visible smoke and steam were unsettling, the true danger was the invisible enemy that began to seep into the basements of family homes: carbon monoxide. This colorless, odorless gas is a byproduct of incomplete combustion, and as the fire consumed the coal with limited oxygen, it produced massive amounts of this deadly toxin. It traveled through the cracks in the rock, following the path of least resistance, right up into the living rooms where families watched television. People began to complain of constant headaches, lethargy, and nausea, symptoms they initially attributed to the flu or seasonal allergies, unaware that they were slowly being poisoned in their sleep. To combat this silent killer, the Department of Environmental Resources began installing loud, industrial-sized gas monitors in the homes located in the impact zone. These devices were designed to sound a piercing alarm whenever the gas levels became critical, a sound that would soon become the soundtrack of life in Centralia. It wasn't uncommon for a family to be sitting down for dinner, only to be interrupted by the shrieking wail of the monitor, forcing them to evacuate their own house in the middle of a meal. "Get the windows open." Now a father would shout, grabbing the children and rushing them out into the cold night air to breathe. The psychological toll of living on top of a fire began to fracture the once tight community, creating a bitter divide between those who wanted to leave and those who refused to believe the danger was real. Neighbors stopped talking to each other, accusing the alarmists of trying to ruin property values and kill the town's reputation, while the other side accused the deniers of risking their children's lives. The town council meetings turned into shouting matches, filled with desperation and anger, as the government officials offered vague promises and endless studies, but very little concrete action. The fire was not just burning the coal, it was burning the social fabric of the town. By the late 1970 seconds, the situation had escalated from a nuisance to a full-blown environmental crisis, and the physical signs of the fire were becoming impossible to ignore. The asphalt on Route 61, the main highway running through the town, began to buckle and crack under the intense subterranean heat, requiring constant repairs that never lasted long. Drivers reported seeing smoke curling up from the road surface as they drove by, and in some spots, the tarmac was soft and sticky, melting from the bottom up. The vegetation on the hillsides began to die off, leaving behind skeleton trees bleached white by the toxic fumes, standing like silent sentinels over the dying town. The turning point for many, the moment when the abstract fear became a concrete reality, happened at a gas station owned by the town's mayor, John Coddington. For weeks, the station's dipstick had been coming up hot when he checked the fuel levels, a strange phenomenon that he couldn't quite figure out. Concerned that something was mechanically wrong, he decided to lower a thermometer on a string down into the underground tank to see what the temperature actually was. When he pulled it back up, he stared at the reading in disbelief, his face draining of color as the reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The thermometer read 172 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature so high that the gasoline was essentially simmering in the tank, dangerously close to its flash point. If the fuel had ignited, the resulting explosion would have leveled the entire city block and killed anyone nearby, turning the heart of Centralia into a crater. Shut it down. Shut it all down. Coddington likely ordered his staff, realizing that his business was sitting on top of a blast furnace. The gas station was condemned, and the fuel was pumped out immediately. But the message was clear. The fire was no longer just in the mines. It was knocking on the front door. Despite this terrifying near miss, the bureaucracy of the state and federal government continued to move at a glacial pace, paralyzed by the skyrocketing costs of fixing the problem. Every year they waited. The fire grew larger, and the price tag to extinguish it jumped from thousands to millions, eventually becoming so high that they simply stopped trying to put it out. They shifted their strategy from extinguishment to monitoring, essentially admitting defeat and telling the residents that they were on their own. The people of Centralia were trapped in a legal and bureaucratic limbo, unable to sell their worthless homes but unable to afford to move elsewhere. As the decade drew to a close, the residents tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, celebrating holidays and attending church. But the ground beneath them was preparing its most terrifying surprise yet. The heat had been drying out the soil and burning away the timber supports in the old mines for nearly 20 years, creating massive, unstable voids just below the surface. The structural integrity of the town was failing, and the earth was getting ready to swallow anything or anyone that was unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The slow burn was over. The nightmare was about to begin. The date was February 14, 1981. A Saturday that began, like any other Valentine's Day, in the quiet, snowy hills of Pennsylvania. For 12-year-old Todd Domboski, the political battles and geological studies regarding the mine fire were distant, adult concerns that had very little to do with his daily life of playing outside. He was spending the afternoon at his grandmother's house, a place that represented safety and warmth, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath that specific plot of land was reaching a critical breaking point. The fire had been eating away at the rock and soil supports underneath the backyard for years, creating a thin, fragile crust over a superheated void that was waiting for just the right amount of weight to trigger a collapse. Todd was walking across the yard, dressed in a heavy parka and boots to ward off the winter chill, when he noticed a small wisp of smoke curling up from the grass near a tree. Curious, as any young boy would be, he walked over to investigate the source of the smoke, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. In a split second, the sensation of solid earth vanished from beneath his feet, replaced by a terrifying drop into nothingness. There was no warning rumble, no cracking sound. The earth simply opened up like a trapdoor, swallowing him whole into a muddy, steaming darkness that smelled of sulfur and death. As he fell, Todd instinctively threw his arms out, his fingers scrabbling desperately against the slimy, hot mud of the sinkhole's walls. Miraculously, his hands found purchase on an exposed tree root that was jutting out from the side of the pit, halting his fall just a few feet below the surface. He hung there, his legs dangling into the abyss, screaming for help as the heat from the mine fire surged up around him like a blast furnace. The air inside the hole was thick with carbon monoxide, a poisonous gas that began to make him dizzy almost immediately, threatening to loosen his grip and drop him into the inferno below. His cousin, Eric Wolfgang, who was just a few yards away, heard the scream and turned to see Todd's head disappearing into the earth. Acting on pure adrenaline, Eric rushed to the edge of the gaping hole, ignoring the very real danger that the ground might give way beneath him as well. "Give me your hand," Eric likely screamed, reaching down into the swirling steam to grab Todd's wrist. His own feet slipping in the mud, he hauled Todd upward with every ounce of strength he possessed, dragging the terrified boy out of the pit and rolling them both onto the safe, solid grass of the lawn. Todd stood up, shaking and covered in a thick layer of hot, red mud, staring back at the hole that had nearly become his grave. The sinkhole was only about 4 feet wide, but when officials arrived later to measure it, they found that it dropped down endlessly into the mine, and the temperature inside was a staggering 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon monoxide levels were lethal, enough to kill a human being in minutes, meaning that if Todd had fallen all the way down, or if the tree root had snapped, he would have been cooked alive or suffocated before anyone could have reached him. The near-death experience of Todd Domboski became the flashpoint that finally shattered the town's denial and forced the rest of the world to pay attention. This wasn't just a matter of bad smells or warm basements anymore. The ground was literally trying to eat the children of Centralia. The image of the young boy, covered in mud and looking traumatized, was plastered across newspapers and television screens nationwide, turning Centralia from a local curiosity into a national symbol of environmental disaster. The residents, who had been patient for nearly 2 decades, suddenly realized that their patience could cost them their lives. The psychological atmosphere in the town shifted overnight from anxiety to outright terror, as parents became afraid to let their children play in their own backyards. Every crack in the sidewalk, every wisp of steam, and every patch of dead grass was now viewed as a potential death trap. People began sleeping with their windows open despite the freezing winter temperatures, terrified that the carbon monoxide would seep into their bedrooms and kill them in their sleep. The town was no longer a home. It was a battlefield where the enemy was the very land they lived on, and the enemy was winning. A furious town meeting was held shortly after the incident, where the atmosphere was charged with a volatile mix of grief, rage, and desperation. Residents screamed at government officials, demanding to know why it had taken a child nearly dying for them to take the situation seriously. "What is the price of a human life?" a mother might have shouted from the back of the room, her voice trembling with emotion. The officials, who had spent years hiding behind studies and budget constraints, finally had nowhere left to hide. The illusion of safety had been permanently pierced, and the community demanded an immediate solution. They wanted out. The climax of the town's struggle came in the form of a federal referendum, a vote that would decide the fate of Centralia once and for all. The U.S. Congress, pressured by the media storm and the undeniable danger, appropriated $42 million to buy out the residents and relocate them to safer ground. It was a victory, but a bitter one, because it meant the death of the town they loved. The community was torn apart, not by the fire, but by the decision of whether to take the money and leave or to stay and fight for their homes. As the buyout process began, the town started to resemble a war zone, with bulldozers moving in to demolish the homes of those who had sold out. The streets became a patchwork of empty lots and boarded-up houses, creating a ghostly jagged landscape that mirrored the fractured spirit of the community. The fire continued to burn beneath them, indifferent to the human drama playing out on the surface. Moving deeper and hotter into the coal seams, the nightmare had fully arrived. And for the people of Centralia, the only way to wake up was to leave everything they had ever known behind. The federal buyout began in earnest in 1984, marking the beginning of a slow, agonizing funeral for the town of Centralia. Moving trucks became a permanent fixture on the streets, lining up to carry away the possessions of families who had lived there for generations. It wasn't a sudden exodus, but a painful dripping away of the population, neighbor by neighbor, friend by friend. It feels like we are attending our own wake, a resident might have whispered, watching their childhood home being emptied of furniture and memories. The tight-knit fabric of the community was unraveling, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the smoke. Once a family moved out, the government wasted no time in ensuring they could never return to the danger zone. Bulldozers and demolition crews moved in immediately, tearing down the empty Victorian houses and leveling the manicured lawns into piles of mud and rubble. The town began to take on a gap-toothed, sickly appearance, with a perfectly maintained home standing next to a weed-filled lot where a house had stood just days before. The physical erasure of the town was methodical and cold, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the people who were being forced to sign over their deeds to the state. Despite the clear danger and the generous buyout offers, a small, hardened group of residents refused to budge. They believed that the government was exaggerating the fire's threat to seize the mineral rights to the millions of dollars worth of anthracite coal beneath their feet. They saw the buyout not as a rescue mission, but as a grand conspiracy, a land grab orchestrated by powerful corporate interests. "I'm not leaving my home until I die," an elderly resident would declare, sitting on his porch while the house next door was reduced to splinters by a claw hammer. The infrastructure of the town began to surrender to the subterranean assault as the fire moved directly beneath the main artery of travel, Route 61, the highway that connected Centralia to the outside world, was eventually closed indefinitely because the ground beneath it was literally boiling. The asphalt buckled into 4-foot-high mounds, cracked open by fissures that spewed toxic gas, making it look like the aftermath of a massive earthquake. This abandoned stretch of road became known as the Graffiti Highway, a post-apocalyptic canvas where visitors left their marks before the state finally covered it with mounds of dirt to keep people away. The legal death of Centralia arrived in 1992, when the governor of Pennsylvania invoked the power of eminent domain to condemn all remaining properties. This legal maneuver meant that the handful of people who had stayed were now technically squatters in their own homes, living on land owned by the Commonwealth. To add the final nail to the coffin, the U.S. Postal Service revoked the town's zip code, 17927. In 2002, you can't send mail to a ghost, a postal worker might have thought, as Centralia was officially erased from the map, existing only as a memory and a warning. One of the most heartbreaking moments of this slow decline involved a time capsule that had been buried by the residents in 1966. Back then, they had optimistically buried it to celebrate the town's centennial, with instructions for it to be opened in 2016 by the next generation. When 2016 finally arrived, the capsule was indeed opened, but not by a thriving community of descendants. It was opened by a handful of former residents standing in a near-empty park. The joyful future they had envisioned in 1966 had been stolen from them, replaced by a legacy of fire, ash, and displacement. As the houses disappeared, nature began to aggressively reclaim the land, erasing the grid of streets and sidewalks that had once defined the town. Where there were once rows of row homes and corner stores, there were now fields of overgrown brush and young trees, hiding the foundations of what used to be. You could walk down what was once a busy avenue and hear nothing but the wind in the leaves and the faint, rhythmic hissing of steam escaping from the ground. It was a landscape of disappearances, where the only proof of human existence was a lonely stop sign or a set of concrete steps leading to nowhere. The investigation into stopping the fire had long since hit a dead end, with experts concluding that the blaze had become too massive to fight. The fire had spread across nearly 400 acres of underground coal seams, and engineers estimated there was enough fuel down there to keep it burning for another 250 years. It was a geological cancer that had metastasized beyond any hope of surgery, and the only treatment was to quarantine the patient. The fire was no longer an emergency to be solved. It was a permanent feature of the landscape, a reminder of human error that would outlive everyone involved. In the absence of residents, a new type of person began to populate the streets of Centralia, the disaster tourist. People from all over the country traveled to walk the empty streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the smoke or feel the heat through their shoes. They treated the tragedy like a theme park, taking selfies in front of the warning signs that read "Danger, Underground Mine Fire." "It's so creepy here," a teenager might giggle, snapping a photo for social media, completely disconnected from the profound loss and suffering that the empty lots represented for the families who were displaced. By the 2010 seconds, the population had dwindled to fewer than 10 people, a stubborn rear guard living in a scattered collection of remaining houses. These holdouts had won a lawsuit allowing them to stay until they died, after which their property would be seized and demolished by the state. They lived a solitary existence, surrounded by ghosts and the ever-present smell of sulfur, tending to their gardens while the world around them reverted to wilderness. They were the captains of a sunken ship, refusing to board the lifeboats, determined to go down with the vessel that had defined their entire lives. As the sun sets over the broken hills of Centralia today, the atmosphere shifts from melancholic to something truly unsettling. The smoke that rises from the vents seems to thicken in the twilight, twisting into shapes that look almost human against the darkening sky. The investigation is over, the town is gone, and the fire has won the war, leaving behind a scar on the earth that refuses to heal. But the story isn't just about the fire. It's about what happens when the place you call home decides to turn against you. We have one final chapter to explore, to look at the ultimate fate of this place and what it means for us. If you travel to Centralia today, you will find a landscape that is both hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. A place where the boundary between the past and the present has been completely erased. Standing high on a hill, overlooking the valley where the town once stood, is the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It is one of the few structures that remains perfectly intact, its white walls and blue domes gleaming against the backdrop of a forest that is slowly swallowing the ruins below. It stands like a silent watchman, a solitary witness to the slow-motion apocalypse that wiped an entire community off the map, leaving only memories and smoke in its wake. Down in the valley, the grid of streets that once bustled with children playing and neighbors chatting is now a ghostly network of cracked pavement and encroaching weeds. In some places, you can still see the curbs and the driveways that lead to nowhere, marking the spots where families once parked their cars and lived their lives. It feels like the rapture happened here. The people simply vanished, and the earth is busy digesting what they left behind. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind and the occasional hiss of steam venting from a rusted pipe, a reminder that the monster is still awake beneath the surface. The fire itself has migrated over the decades, moving deep into the complex geology of the anthracite coal seams, traveling miles away from the original ignition point at the landfill. Experts estimate that the fire could continue to burn for another 250 years, fueled by the massive reserves of coal that were once the town's economic lifeblood. It is a cruel irony that the very resource that built Centralia, the black diamond that gave the town its purpose and its wealth, is the very thing that destroyed it. The town was literally consumed by its own reason for existing, eaten alive by the industry that sustained it. For the handful of residents who refused to leave, the holdouts who fought the government for decades, the story is entering its final, quiet chapter. In 2013, a settlement was finally reached that allowed the remaining 7 residents to stay in their homes for the rest of their lives. However, the agreement came with a stark condition: once they pass away, their property will be seized by the state, and their houses will be demolished. There will be no inheritance, no passing down the family home to the next generation. When the last resident dies, Centralia will officially cease to exist as a place for the living. The famous graffiti highway, the abandoned stretch of Route 61 that became a canvas for artists and a destination for curious tourists, has also met a grim fate. In 2020, weary of the liability and the crowds of people trespassing on dangerous ground, the private owner of the land brought in massive dump trucks to cover the road with thousands of tons of dirt. The colorful history of the highway was buried, just like the town itself, hidden under a mound of earth to discourage anyone from remembering what was there. The state is actively trying to erase the scar, to turn the town back into a forest, as if hoping that nature will eventually hide the magnitude of their mistake. It is difficult to look at Centralia without thinking about the pop culture phenomenon it inspired, specifically the horror video game and movie franchise Silent Hill. While the movie features falling ash and monsters, the reality of Centralia is far more terrifying because it is so mundane and avoidable. There are no supernatural demons here, only the very real demons of human error, bureaucratic negligence, and the unstoppable force of nature. The horror of Centralia isn't about jump scares. It is about the slow, crushing realization that everything you worked for can be taken away by a fire that no one bothered to put out when it was small. Reflecting on that fateful day in May 1962, it is maddening to think about how easily this entire tragedy could have been prevented if the town council had paid to haul the trash away instead of burning it, or if the firefighters had dug out the embers properly. History would have been completely different. Centralia serves as a grim monument to the butterfly effect, a testament to how a single, seemingly small decision can spiral out of control and destroy the lives of thousands. It is a warning to us all that the consequences of our actions can burn far longer and hotter than we ever arguably deserve. The story of Centralia also taps into a primal fear that exists in all of us, the fear that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as we think it is. We build our homes and our lives on the assumption of stability, trusting that the earth will hold us up. But Centralia proves that this trust is fragile. The residents went to sleep one night in a thriving town and woke up in a disaster zone, their foundations literally cooking from the heat below. It reminds us that our control over the environment is an illusion, and that when the earth decides to take back what is hers, there is very little we can do to stop it. Today, the smoke still rises from the vents near the old cemetery, curling around the headstones of the people who were lucky enough to die before their town did. The ground is still warm to the touch in the dead of winter, a localized geothermal anomaly that defies the seasons. If you stand there long enough, in the quiet of the Pennsylvania hills, you can almost hear the echoes of the town that used to be. You can imagine the sound of the school bell, the laughter of children, and the hum of a community that never suspected they were living on top of a furnace. Centralia is no longer a town. It is a lesson written in ash and coal, a permanent scar on the American landscape that refuses to heal. It teaches us about the persistence of fire, the stubbornness of the human spirit, and the terrifying power of the world beneath us. The fire will eventually go out, centuries from now, when the last lump of coal has turned to dust. But by then, there will be no one left to remember the names of the streets or the people who lived there. The earth will have finally reclaimed its own, leaving behind nothing but a quiet, green forest and a legend about a town that burned from the inside out.